to some less scientific but more philosophical musings I've been reading in a book that I have been browsing piece by piece through for some months now, called Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps, which is a multifaceted story of a saga that took place around the turn of the century, about which we're currently rather concerned because that was the advent of quantum mechanics. And from this book and my readings tonight, it occurred to me that we have a convention for communication in science based on accepted units, each of which is somewhat arbitrary. And part of the story in this rather engaging book, whose subtitle is Empires of Time, the notion of metricization is one of convention and standardization. The system that had been adopted in the 1880s, called the CGS system, gave the linear metric in centimeter, the weight measure in gram, and the time measure in seconds. If you look up international units in Wikipedia or some other recent authoritative source, you'll find that there's rather a long list of accepted standard units in essentially two classes, the second of which is considered to be derived units. All of this may sound like some dry catalog of information, but the concept of metricization goes right to the root of what we're dealing with in spaceTime and in quantum mechanics, which, as I've been pointing out in the past few lectures, more directly than ever, are related, intrinsically related. It's time to take more of an overview of what we're doing, which for any one man is what he's doing, but on behalf of science is what we're doing, not any one man. And what is it that we're doing? One musing, which I would like to relate to you now, because I think this is a fruitful musing, is that there are always at least two considerations involved. Really, in physics or in mathematics or in science or in life. One of which is our attempt to match what we can utilize from the universe with our needs. The universe, rather broadly and philosophically, abstractly speaking, simply is what it is, and would be what it is without humans. And even if one has an anthropomorphic theory or idea, which I believe I had said in a recent lecture was the anthropologic principle. It's anthropomorphic because morphic means form. Anthropologic means the study of humans, whereas anthropomorphic means human form. And the anthropomorphic principle contradicts what I just said about the independence of the human realm from the universe as it would be with or without humans. We do have an effect on our environment, and that environment has expanded by a small amount in the past century, to give a rough time bracket, such that our influence in the universe cannot any longer be said to be restricted to below the stratosphere. Even in the 19th century, one could say that the effects of industrialization were beginning to have an effect, for instance, on the ozone layer, which is quite high in the atmosphere. But today, in the 21st century, first quarter thereof, not much really has changed in the way of our effect upon the universe. But the way we do look at the universe, although it is strongly overshadowed by the omnipresence of the universe at large, virtually all of which has remained untouched by the works of man on Earth, even considering our Voyager craft, which is really, there were 2 Voyager crafts and 2 Pioneer crafts launched into the outer solar system back, I believe it was in the 1970s. I may be off by a decade. But 2 of which are still ticking on their radioactive fuel cells and have left the heliosphere, which is quite far out. Now, to say that those tiny little specks hurtling through space away from the sun have any effect on the universe in any sense would require quite a philosophical leap, I think. But when we consider our position both as a human race and really on a time span, the human race, including all humans going back in time, alive or dead, and considering ourselves each as individuals, particularly as an individual, one must consider oneself unique, at least from one's own point of view. That, for any of us, is the center of the universe. And this is philosophical, but I'm attempting to set up a juxtaposition or a relationship in perspective which I believe can have a strong positive effect on our attitude and orientation toward what we are attempting to do in science and with science in any sense that I've brought up so far. And the point that I'm attempting to get to has to do with our current unit basis for measuring the universe, which, as you may know, in the conventional unit metricization of physical quantities, as of the 1960s, an unheard of proposition was forwarded and rapidly accepted and remains to this day concerning the definition of the basis of physical measurement. And even if you're already aware of what I'm about to tell you and have already guessed what I'm about to say, which is the standardization of light speed, whatever your attitude toward that, either of surprise or perhaps reverence, I find in myself a combination of both of those at all times, because there is no metric unit thus far established in any country or by any consensual arrangement between nations or groups that has not been totally arbitrary. From ancient times, the linear spatial separation index has been something like the inch. It was the French who introduced, at least in Europe, the idea of standardization around the decimal system, which has led to the acceptance of the meter rather than the inch-foot system, which was basically the English convention, still used in America. And having two systems, the metric system and the inch-foot system, at least for linear spatial measurement, was something that came up in my education because it was a transition time, and in some sense still is. But the universe does not actually recognize or acknowledge any of our metric systems. The universe is the standard by which we derive metric systems. And all metric systems can be changed at any time in their base unit. For instance, either the inch or the centimeter. The second is one of the units used in lightSpeed. The other unit is the metre. And as you know, that is meters per second, which is called, using the word dimensionality or dimension in a secondary sense or a alternate sense, the word dimension here having two distinct meanings, although they overlap. Light speed is called a two-dimensional unit. It's not two linear dimensions, but one of the dimensions is linear. And that's what I wanted to bring up tonight, pertaining to our current vector in the solution to the most difficult and most profound question that's ever come before science: the unification of physics into one coherent system. Why do we want to do that? And who is we? Please forgive me, I have a debilitating case of asthma. And since I've allowed the cat in due to the cold and due to my need for love of any kind, she's dwelling with me and sleeping very close to my nose every night. And so I have a good deal of phlegm, which is considered by most civilized human beings to be filthy and gross due to superstition. So forgive me for being human. The standardization of light speed was fixed for all time, so that by agreement it will never be changed, and light speed is now fixed at a whole number, measured excuse me, to give a superstitious, purely emotional verbal enunciation for my filthy fucking phlegm. Light speed measured in units of meters can be composed in multiples of those meters for convenience based on the decimal system, such that we are accustomed now, ever since the 1960s, certainly when this was finalized for all time, it will never change, that light speed is fixed. At 299 million meters and a fraction. So that it is convenient in the human mind who is attempting to, as we say, wrap our mind around some concept like light speed. And finding it far more convenient to round off the speed of light. If there were a convention arranged tomorrow of all the scientists of the world who all by magic agreed that they're all going to do something together, which I now propose, it would be entirely reasonable and could be done overnight with the snap of a finger to establish a change to the 1966 convention so that the number arrived at for light speed was not a 9-digit number. It could be made into a 1-digit number with no side effects. How would that go over or affect the world in science or in the more general human situation? Would it have any effect at all other than to make things easier for all of us by just saying that light speed is 3? And then all you have to do is remember the unit, which if we wanted to stick with the meter and the second, both of which are required as base units, to get the composite standard unit for light speed, we could simply say that it is 300 million meters per second instead of 299,792,458. I won't tell you how long it took me to memorize that. Some people can memorize numbers like that fairly instantly, but it would be a relative measurement of speed of memorization. My memorization capacity, I have become convinced by just time, is absolutely average. Nothing particularly exciting in either direction, either towards retardedness, which would be one way to characterize stupidity or slowness, or genius, excellence, photographic memory, whatever it might be called, because who cares? We have calculators who can do the memorization and calculation for us anyway. But in the conceptualization in the human mind of what is light speed, we are reliant on conventional units. And what I'm driving toward is what exactly is light speed? What is that? What does that mean? Every Joe, from the dumbest sophomore to the most advanced PhD specialist, has exactly the same conceptualization of light speed, which is quite simple to state in rather brutal terms. We assume that we know what that is because we all agree what it is. So let me ask you something. Do you know what it is? Because I'm about to tell you some potentially traumatically shocking information that I happen to know. And perhaps the trauma and shock might cause you to react like you just don't want to hear it, or you'd rather argue, or whatever you think about me or my ideas. But since my job as a communicator is to make sure we're all on the same page, I would like to present you with a proposition about light speed. That nobody alive or dead, including Einstein, can state at all what is meant by light speed. Because nobody knows what light is. And in the case of light traveling, nobody knows what in the world that means. Nobody knows what light speed is, because light cannot travel. It has no impetal force behind it. So it's not traveling with velocity. It's not traveling in the conventional sense of motion. It's not moving. And you may object to that, and you should, of course, because it is moving. And here I must draw you up and force you to sit your ass down and listen as I explain this through. Because this is superpositional. When you say that light has a velocity, at basis, just to start out, you cannot possibly know what you're even talking about or saying, because nobody knows what light is. And if you disagree, let's take a little quiz here. I'll give you a multiple choice because that's the easiest test question of all. What is light? And here are your choices. Is it a particle? Or is it a wave? And you would do very well not to answer until you know the rules of the multiple choice questionnaire. Because there are at least 3 forms of multiple choice known in the testing world. And if you just rudely and stupidly blunder into this trap and give one of 4 answers which you might come up with, your answer would either be the first choice, the second choice, both choices, or neither choice. Correct? You might not be allowed to give both answers, and you might not be allowed to give neither answer. And if you were allowed to give both answers, you might have to fill in a blank, which this would be illegal because since I didn't tell you about this, but I can add it at any time and just fuck you up. Rudely and illegally, because I'm the goddamn tester. And if I want to fuck you up and trip you up illegally, I can get away with it because you're not in command. So hopefully, as a good scientist who's learned how to use your rational mind in the quicksand of human interactions. The only right answer that could be given at this point, given what I've told you thus far, is you will refuse to answer until you have more information. And then I will give you the worst possible news, which is this. You're free to answer in any way you like. So you can either say that light is a particle, or you can say that light is a wave, or you can say that it's both and not tell me why you think so, or tell me why you think so. Or you can say that it's neither, and then either tell me why you think it's neither, or explain to me why it's neither. So I give you all options. And now, in your own mind, since I can't force you to this physically, you're going to have to consent to this perhaps rude-sounding test. But in your own mind, if you're up for the challenge, like a brave scientist would be, because we love puzzles, even if it's being given by a semi-demigod who has a megalomanic complex all of a sudden because he just woke up from a nap, you would answer, and you would be glad to answer, and you would thank me, as you should. Because I'm on your side doing this. I'm not trying to hurt you, okay? But I want you to seriously, in your own mind right now, whether you're right or wrong, don't worry. It's not like you're going to heaven or hell if you get it right or wrong, okay? So just try it out on yourself. What is light speed? What is light? That's the current question. And you know we're going to get to the next question, which is what is speed? We think we know, don't we? And so this may seem like a little parlor game. But currently, I'm in process of answering for you, as I already have for myself. What is the answer to the questions in science that we need to have answered? And we're driving toward what I really want to talk about, which you and I each have to talk about in the privacy of our own heart, but we might be able to share with each other if we're true scientists who've achieved a modicum of wisdom, so that we're not always arguing, okay? The purpose of science is not to argue. The purpose of dissent, controversy, and arguing is constructive in science. It's not to hurt each other. It's to arrive at a common goal, which we all have agreed to lend ourselves to. So let me cut to the chase, which I should have looked up. I meant to look up what does it mean, cut to the chase. Let me just do that real quickly. I'll keep talking while I'm doing it if I'm capable of doing so. Cut to the chase. Okay, Wikipedia, that'll probably have the answer. To get to the point without wasting time, okay. Cut to the chase, okay, it's from the film industry. An early version of the phrase is found in Canterbury Tales from the year around 1400, and shortly forth this tale for to chase, to cut a long story short. And shortly forth this tale for to chase. From 1880 to 1940, there was a phrase, a variant of this, called cut to Hecuba, which I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. This refers to something from Hamlet. Okay, so, in other words, who cares? So it means get to the point without wasting time, and that's all anybody really knows. Which, for me, I would have to say is sufficient. I hope it is for you too. But to cut to the chase, what I'm driving at is, what is the goal? Let's say that we get the grand unification theory, so that it's no longer a theory. That's the point. If it's a grand unification theory, that means it's a puzzle. Theory means puzzle in science. As you know, I have some vendettas against conventional science, abusive conventional science, where what I just said is violated. So that, for instance, there are two theories which are no longer puzzles. There are two theories now which have been advanced artificially and illegally and illogically to the status of we figured it out. We've got the answer. And I hope I've made clear to you so that I don't have to go into another rant, which is really becoming tedious even to me, that natural selection and cosmological expansion are absolutely incorrect formulations and cannot be said even to be theories. There's no such thing as cosmological expansion, for the same reason that there's no such thing as biological evolutionary natural selection, to give all of the rather redundant terms in that ridiculous, irrational quasi-theory. Which is irreligious and against humanity. So that is not the goal. The goal is not to lie about where we're from. But we're not in biology. I always bring that up because you'd better always remember that in the back of your mind. Basically for the same reason that when you leave the laboratory and your books and perhaps these videos or interviews on the internet where you're being entertained, and I hope I'm speaking to people who don't do that. Although we all do, it's not your primary interest. You're looking for the truth to help your life. Correct? That is what you're doing. Or you're in the wrong place already. I don't even know why you're looking at my videos, because I'm not here to entertain you. Although, for a truly wise man who's enlisted to science for the right reason under the auspices of superintelligence, which sees and knows everything that you and I are doing, whether you believe that or not makes no difference because science has already proved it. What are we doing in attempting to understand the universe? Ooh. Is that just so you can get a thrilly-dilly? Well, I believe it is. I believe that the highest form of fun is wisdom. There's a unfortunate counterpoint that always has to be borne in mind. Just as I was about to say, you're not going to solve the situations here on Earth. Neither with minority rights, minorities of any kind. You're not going to solve the genocide that's going on in Palestine right now, and you're not going to end the war in Ukraine, no matter what you do. So you can't really solve anything that's real, can you? Well, neither can I. So what are we doing? Well, if you want to go with convention, and you believe that convention decides reality, since we're humans, and that's somewhat real, one would have to say, well, it's been decided for us already why we're doing science. And do you know what that reason is? It's a superpositional answer. But if a person is unaware of the ramifications of the question and is willing to just be lazy, as 99% of Americans certainly are so lazy that they will get the wrong answer, and if I were to ask a typical American what is science, they would start talking about cuckoo clocks, by which I mean jet engines, nuclear reactors, lasers, and spaceflight, and telescopy, all of which are toys. Now I'll just interject here, just for the sake of a certain sense of completeness. I know of astronomers, and I do accept that this is the highest form of science in the context of which we're speaking, which is why we're doing science at all. If we're doing science for some kind of goal, and not just to amuse ourselves while we're alive, following which, after death, what we did meant nothing and means nothing now, but we have nothing else to do. So if we're going to choose something to do, might as well be science. Well, there is a certain degree of wisdom involved in that simplification. But I know of astronomers whom I respect more highly than myself. Which is, you can just accept that whether you pity me or not. I don't give a living what you think about my opinions. But I'm sharing this with you in the name of science, so you'd better give me the time of day on this. So what I'd like to say is, I know of astronomers whom I respect more highly than myself, I'll just say in this context of science, who regard the telescope as holy. Now I already know what your immediate reaction is, so don't think that you're going to escape my wrath, if that's what it is. I hope I have already convinced you this is not wrath. But it does involve the human equation. Why would I think that an astronomer's regard for the telescope, any telescope, as an instrument that's holy? First, I'd have to define what that means, but I think you can guess. You wouldn't be far off whatever your guess is, because I'm not sure myself. Holy? Isn't that like something from the Bible? What is it, like something from the temple where they weren't building telescopes? There's nothing in Exodus that talks about anything like a telescope. And there's nothing in the Bible that talks about telescopy, or indeed astronomy, directly. Although I have told you the story of Abraham, well worth knowing if you want the high road and the short path to understand religion totally better than people in religion understand it. You could do worse than beginning with the story of Abraham, since Yeshua's entire mission was based on validating Abraham as the chief prophet of earth for all time. Okay? So Yeshua regarded Abraham extraordinarily highly. And Abraham was an astronomer. And that is in the Bible. And it's the only incident of astronomy in Holy Scripture. So one could make a case that astronomy is holy. I do make that case because that can be proved. Astronomy is holy. And you can invent your own concept of holiness, which will go beyond all other concepts of holiness in pure logic and rationality, by saying and beginning with a statement that the highest form of science is astronomy. That is obvious. So you do accept that. Or if you haven't thought about it until now, I'm telling you, you must accept that. But does that mean that the telescope is holy? No. But I still do not think it's a contradiction for my fellow astronomers, whom I respect more highly than myself in the realm of astronomy, because they're more accomplished and they have a better attitude toward it than I do. Something I cannot at this time correct, because it's dependent on factors beyond my instant control. But I respect this point of view more highly than my own. And I can do that without any contradiction, although it leaves a kind of a wound in me. The telescope cannot by any standard be considered holy, but because it's concerned with astronomy, It might be. And this leads us back into the main topic that I'm attempting to broach for open consideration, open discussion if this were a forum. I am not a commandant, okay? I am not anyone's idea of a leader, certainly not even to myself. So this is basically just one scientist speaking out in the way scientists must. This is my duty, as I see it. So I am being consistent with the dictates of science as I understand it by broaching this rather philosophical topic, which has to do with definitions, basis units, conventionalization, and unity of effort, consensual purpose, going to the question which affects us all of what is science, why do we do it, what is its goal, what is its purpose. You can answer in any way you want. It's not multiple choice, it's free form. And if this were an open forum under sufficient control of wisdom, we could talk about it for as long as we wish, to effect, to purpose, to increase our momentum in the right direction, to accomplish our goal of science. Could you summarize to yourself in any way what is the purpose of science? And to complete a former unfinished thought, what most people would say, and I believe even I myself would react this way, even though I know better, but the first and most obvious answer of what is science, it's to build technological systems, such as objects, but it's not just objects. It has to do with the utilization of structure. And we do need to build things in order to realize the advantages of technology, but without the use of specialized tools, both in geometry and in mathematics, this would be impossible. This is why it took so long for humankind to achieve the Industrial Revolution, which has now hurtled us in basically a hyperbolic trajectory into the stars, to put it kind of in Victorian Romance language, metaphorical language. But the situation, I'll say for a certain percentage of humanity right now, which would include myself, the situation of humanity is far in advance of anything that our forebears could even imagine. And just going back one generation from myself, on the rather arbitrary definition of what is a generation, for me, I would just say, for our purposes right here, it would be approximately 40 to 60 years. It's usually given about half of that, but it doesn't matter greatly because a generation is not a very precise unit. It is not meant to be. It's supposed to be for a broad stroke approach. It's more of a perspective. Unit of measurement is a generation, because obviously 1,000 generations would be much different than one. That's about all we need to be concerned with. My parents were traumatized by the advances of science, and they were simply typical. It wasn't because they were in any way inferior to later people, for instance their children such as myself. They're exactly the same kind of human that I am, in that sense. Which is to say that even though there's no such thing as biological evolution, one can definitely say that there is human evolution. It's not passed on genetically, though. It's passed on socially through education and other means of communication between humans. Basically, to convey what I've already told you, according to a very logical construction of what it is we can pass on from one generation to the next, would be knowledge, and understanding. It's more difficult to pass on wisdom, and it is difficult to pass on understanding. But it is possible and necessary to pass on knowledge, which is why it's always a tragedy to find out, for instance, the destruction of a repository of information, such as, for instance, the library at Alexandria, which at that time contained the combined knowledge of the ancient world. And when Alexandria was burned, its library was reduced to ash. It was a tremendous loss which was felt throughout scientific communities and has never been corrected. So we've had to go on without that repository of ancient knowledge. We lost it. And that is the loss of the greatest treasure, I believe, in humanity, other than human beings themselves. So what we've inherited today, to get right down to the logical, simplest access point to this topic I'm broaching, is we now have a fixed definition of light speed, and it is the only unit of measurement that has ever been consensually fixed for all time, for all eternity, if you would, if you like to use those kind of terms. Light speed is a fixed unit in the two-dimensional unit form that I already described at the beginning of this conversation, or lecture as you might call it. What does that do for us? What it does is it enables us to have a standard around which all other units may be measured. That has not yet happened to its fullest extent. It is just one unit in a system of units, which does include a base unit of kilogram, so the gram is still used, from carryover from the CGS system. The centimeter is still used, but it's now considered to be the meter, which is just a multiple of a centimeter, as is a kilometer, they're all multiples of each other. So the C has been retained in CGS. The G has been retained in the definition of, I believe it's mass, is kilogram, which affects other units of measurement, so that the kilogram is used in combinative units, such as momentum. And the second is fixed for all time, and I'd like to start there because that is our unit of time. Our unit for space is what I actually want to get to, but we need to talk about both space and time as having conventionalized units, because it's important now in order to understand what is space-time. And as I've taught you over the past couple of lectures, although you may already know it, having it retaught never hurts and is very often helpful, because hearing something that you understand being explained in another context or in another way can offer a miraculous breakthrough to understanding which was unexpected, because you thought you understood something when now you realize that there is a higher integration of understanding. That's exactly what's happening with science right now through my effort. And that effort is not really shared anywhere else in science. In other words, I'm alone in my own mind, in a sense, in attempting to further the progress of true science, which in many of my very early lectures 2 years ago, I talked about the actual purpose of science. I've left that behind in order to pursue what science actually does in its attempt to make progress. I'm attempting to make progress. I thought that I was simply going to be an expositor of what we already know. My original purpose in communicating at all in science was at the very basic level of what all scientists do, if they have enough knowledge is simply to express that knowledge, to synthesize it, which is useful because it saves other people time. That's why we go to school, so we don't have to start over, uh, reinventing the wheel. But nobody escapes the necessity to understand in the same way that things have been understood to effect. So that is what we attempt to pass on. In effect, we have to resynthesize for ourselves, either as individuals or in group effort. A lecture situation would be one of those group efforts, to cause or enable, to assist the resynthesization of understanding from the knowledge we do have, because understanding is quite a distinct step from knowledge. The knowledge has to be there or there's nothing to synthesize, but it is the understanding that we want. And then the forward recursive question arises, well, why do we want understanding? What is that for? Now, I have claimed, just to give it a name under a known system of what our understanding is meant to lead us into, it's wisdom, which is a very good term in my opinion, because it just assigns a word to something. It's not very easy to define, because it doesn't get rid of the recursion, for one thing, because then you could ask, and this is the nature of a why question, well, once you achieve understanding, okay, you're saying that that's for wisdom. All right, let's just accept that hypothetically. Well, then what's wisdom for? To produce the highest good for an individual human. Okay, well, let's see if we can define that. What is the highest good that a human being can achieve as an individual? What would that be? You would probably, I suspect, search in your memory banks to something you may have heard or surmised on your own, or some combination, so you have some idea, no matter how vague, of what is your purpose. What would be the highest goal that you could reach as a human? Well, I believe that it is perfectly reasonable, since that is an extraordinarily broad question. You would simply assign it a name equivalent to the word I've used, wisdom, which is what? Well, it's meant to be the next stage after understanding. Okay, well, what's the next stage after wisdom? Well, I'm saying that that would be then the final goal for a human. That may not be the same as the highest goal for humanity, which is all of us. So this is a multifaceted question, which then introduces not complexity, but complication. And complication is not good. It needs to be dealt with very quickly, or thoughts become discordant. They run off in more than one direction, and it's hard to bring them back. So instead of, I'm just showing the broad base of the question without attempting to complicate the issue, except to show that it could be considered complicated. Well, therefore it is. But we don't have to treat it as such. But where would we begin? What would be our metric for answering such an intensive question? What has sometimes been called an eschatological or eschatological question, which has to do, if I'm using that word right, it has to do with purpose. And I've claimed that in order to understand purpose, since it is a form of a paradox, because it is a recursive forward question, very difficult to achieve, is a sort of a visionary. It becomes visionary because you're attempting to project into the future. Because as far as I know, science does not have an answer for that question yet, either for an individual human or for humanity as a whole, or in fact, for science as a province of human endeavor. There is no purpose that is defined. But we must have some working definition, no matter how vague or personalized, correct? So let's see if we can dissect that to effect, that is, to get somewhere. So I return to this question: what is the human goal? However you construe that, I'm simply limiting it to just one person. For instance, myself, but for you it would be for you. What is your highest goal? How do you conceive of yourself in terms of your future trajectory? In science, we like to make predictions. Can you predict where you're going in any way? The cynical answer is the grave, which is the English translation of hell. In other words, at least according to Larry King, who I think said it as well as anyone else, there's a certain fear involved. In Holy Scripture, if you consider the New Testament to be holy, I just use that word because that's the word that's used. I just consider it to be some men's writings with quite a bit of interesting overhead, which should not be overlooked. I am a Bible scholar, so I could be considered biased. I'm not. I'm foremost a logician. The phrase used in that section of Scripture is the fear of death. But I think Larry King spelled it out better. He was more specific. It's the fear of oblivion, which I hope is self-descriptive, because it's very difficult to get final base definitions in science basically due to Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In other words, when you go to define something, you're using words, and then you have to define what those words are. And finally, you have to have a base set of words which are axiomatic. So what did Larry King mean by oblivion? Well, the man he was interviewing at the time, who actually elicited this rather profound statement from Larry King, Norm Macdonald, what Larry is saying is in answer to Norm's friendly, provocative, part of the tete-a-tete going on is, what do you fear about death? As you know, there are certain superstitious ideas promoted by certain religious organizations talking about eternal brimstone or something equally superstitious. But Larry, being a modern man, very well educated, and I think with his feet pretty firmly on the ground, and I think Larry's still with us. I don't think he's gone to the beyond yet. But his fear, which the Bible calls the fear of death, he makes more specific. It's the fear of unknowingness, is having no sense of presence at all. In other words, loss of consciousness. Well, Henry Miller has another point of view on that, which he brought out in his writings, and I believe he lived this way. I don't believe Henry Miller was a hypocrite. He wasn't what you'd call a conventional scientist. He was an artist, and he considered himself to be an artist. And I do too. And that's certainly part of the human equation, because art is fun. And he certainly made it fun for me. I just love Henry Miller. I think he's America's greatest fiction writer in a certain class, because that's the beauty pageant contest, and you don't want to say that this is Miss America when actually there's probably hundreds in different categories of Miss America. The most beautiful girl. There's many forms of beautiful girls. Well, there's many forms of reaction to death. But I think the baseline would be that you don't want to be unconscious forever, but what Henry Miller said is, if we had an ounce of sense in us, we'd be looking forward to it, because, as he put it so beautifully and poetically, or prosaically as the case may be, he said, we spend 1/3 of our lives sleeping like drunken rats. In other words, approximately 8 out of 24 hours, Americans would have to pare that down to the maximum of 6 hours so that they're always on edge and have road rage. But on an average, an optimization against reality, essentially, is we're intended to get 8 hours of sleep and 16 hours of being conscious. And that's also overlooking the area of dreams, which is an interesting and unsolved question in psychology. What is dreaming? Whatever you may think about dreaming, you're still virtually unconscious, okay? And I know from my own experience, I am definitely unconscious, and I could tell some stories from recent personal history of how being totally unconscious can cause you to miss a phone call. In other words, I didn't pick up the phone in a dream and talk with my sister, no. Or if I did, it wouldn't have helped anyway, so yes, I was unconscious. But Henry pointed out that if we had an ounce of sense in us, we'd be looking forward to death, because instead of 1/3 of our time spent really in bliss, it causes us to our bodies restore themselves while we're asleep. It's one reason we must sleep. You'll die if you can't sleep. You have to get sleep, and you can't go too long without a certain amount of sleep, and that is about 1/3 of our lives is spent asleep like drunken rats. Well, Henry says death is nothing more than 3/3 drunken rat-like sleep. And so how can you complain about that? Now, I've added to that in my own little internal philosophy system that for all prior eternity, before we became conscious, somewhere in the one-digit age, presumably we came online after having been gestated inside of our mother's bodies and then delivered by some midwife or doctor, the umbilical cord cut, and of course just immersed in warm water with soothing music and kind faces around, not hung upside down by the ankles and slapped on the butt, which by the way is done for a reason. It's to get the lung material out of the lungs so the baby can breathe. But it is kind of cruel. But the thing's not really conscious, and so whether that traumatizes us is up for grabs to the psychologist. But however we're brought into this world, it's only after birth that we really become, I think most people would be forced to agree to this if they had some doubt about it. Oh no, the fetus is aware. Whatever. So are plants, okay? But consciousness, as we nominally just conventionally conceive it, I think is a reasonable point of view of consciousness, that you're not asleep and you're not gestating in your mom's belly. But my point being that if you go back before the sperm and ovum began the magical process of forming a new creature out of basically nothing but the sperm and ovum, well, that's quite a little trick. The magic of recombinant DNA. Prior to that conjoining of the two objects, what was the standard of your consciousness for all eternity before that, going back to the beginning of human time and before? Well, you were in 3/3 drunken rat-like sleep. So why fear death? I think that Larry King, in his, admittedly, and not meaning this as a slight at all, his irreligious way, is perfectly reasonable to be irreligious if you're pitting religion against science. I'll always take the side of science on that, with a footnote and a caveat that I don't ever discuss anymore, because there are always two sides to human life. And really, what Larry said strikes a chord in me, because it is, if I had a fear of death other than just dread, I mean, you don't want to die. Well, really, that is the question. Why don't you want to die? Well, it's because you don't want to be unconscious forever. You want to wake up when you go to sleep. Well, in Scripture, when Stephen was being stoned to death by the original Zionists, and Paul held his garment because Paul consented to the murder of Stephen, who was a martyr and a prophet, and he showed he was a prophet while he was being killed by telling those goddamn Zionists exactly what God thought of him. And they had already figured out what he was going to say, so they started to kill him before he could get the words out of his mouth, but he beat them to it and told them they're all going to hell. So, at least in Stephen's mind, there are two different paths that you might take after death. But what it was said in the record, whoever wrote that record, is that Stephen fell asleep. And that's good enough for me. However, in the privacy of a man's thoughts, that's not good enough. You still have to come to grips with it. Even though you may accept it, your mind won't rest if it's rational, because the rational mind is the mind that governs this kind of thing. And it's not going to accept a wishy-washy answer. It wants to know, like, what's going to happen to us. That is, both the emotional and logical side. So it's really a combination of an emotional reaction, which for me, I would have to say, as honestly as I can, it's one of dread, because I don't want to die. Well, that's normal. Stephen didn't want to die either. Because you don't want to die because you'd rather live. That's a binary choice, so there's nothing wrong with wanting to live. Well, that does then mean that you don't want to die. So the question then is raised, as it was between Norm Macdonald and Larry King, why don't you want to die? And I think Larry said it correctly. I really do. It's because I don't like the idea of not being conscious forever. That makes no sense to me. That is correct. I'm just saying, in my opinion, but I can prove that it is correct. I don't say my opinion unless, well, I mean, I could be wrong. It could just be an opinion, but I do not believe it is an opinion. The actual scientific, logical response to the concept of death is that it's irrational. It makes no sense. Because if you're conscious now, as I am at this moment of speaking, and you are at your moment of listening, why would you be conscious if it's not going to continue? In other words, are we just, is that all we are? Or do we have a purpose? Is there some reason that we're conscious? And I believe that's the correct way to begin to answer my test question. Is there some reason that we're doing science? It is a conscious activity, obviously. And it is also a consensual and it's a communal activity. Science cannot exist in just one man, although it does consist of men, so there's another superposition. But what is it? Well, what we're asking when we say what is it is not what, really, although we might or we will have to come back to what is science. But we're trying to understand what it's for, which is a why question. Why are we conscious, and why are we doing science while we're conscious? And I believe that the typical answer, to round this out, is the typical answer is we do it to build things. And that is, in my opinion, a valid answer because it's undeniable. I mean, all around us we see the betterment of human life. I can testify to that because I'm not sure that I would be the same person in any sense if I hadn't, at a very early age, found myself above the clouds in a 707 Boeing turbojet airliner, looking down at the clouds of Earth and beneath the clouds to the surface of the Earth from an altitude of what I have come to understand was about 27,000 feet, which is quite a ways up into heaven, in the most broad use of the word heaven. And that has affected me deeply. And I believe this goes to our instinct for seeking the stars, which is well known now, certainly well publicized. I don't consider that to be a superstitious aim. Currently, it's beyond the reach of physics, that is, science. Humans are not going to the stars, and I believe it can be proved that we never will. And an honest man who is not swayed by his emotional, or in this case, the instinctive side, which may be wrong to deny the instinctive side, and I'm coming to that, but we're not going to the stars. We're never going to reach the stars. And so why do we have this instinct to get to the stars and meet aliens? Why do we have this instinct that everyone assents to? On a statistical basis, we all agree that if we can get to the stars, we must. And since currently we can't, although we're still trying, and Elon Musk is the absolute prophet, in a certain extended sense, of this instinct. He embodies that instinct. I believe it's exciting that Elon Musk wants to get us to Mars as the first step to getting to the stars, which rhymes, which is kind of nice. It's from Mars to the stars. Well, Mars is nobody's idea of a legitimate goal for humans because it's deadly to humans, but that extends to the stars as well. Assuming you could project into the future and see in some way the future with us going to the stars, it's not a very happy picture, no, even if it were totally successful. Because we're bound to this ecology, we can't exist without the plant-animal ecology. As humans, we were designed to exist in this ecology. And you're not going to find that anywhere else unless the aliens themselves guide us to where is something equivalent to our ecology. So unless we can change our bodies, which is also being considered because this is a driving instinct, perhaps we can make ourselves into machines and put our consciousness inside of machines so that we're not dependent on our human bodies. But I have already eliminated that option in my own mind. No matter what anyone else has decided, you do not want to leave behind your body. And this also is part of the dread of death, is that we leave behind our bodies. It's not just that we leave behind our consciousness, which really would just be sleep. So that raises a question in the case of the stoning of Stephen by the evil Zionists, who are still at large, by the way, in Israel, and still doing their genocidal thing, murdering anyone who they think is inferior to them. So those original Zionists, of whom Paul was one, interestingly, murdered Stephen in cold blood for no crime that Stephen committed because they hated his guts. And what happens to those men when they die? For Americans, this would be equivalent to asking the question of where does Hitler go when he dies? Where is Hitler now, for instance? Is he just dead and there's no justice? He just did what he did and now he's gone? So that's the flip side of the value of death. It's also in Scripture that the Creator, after he created humans, gave them a lifespan of hundreds of years. That's on record. That's well known. That humans at one time in the early part of our history, which is actually directly after and directly before, around the time of the Chicxulub flood, which is now known, and it's in Wikipedia, the Bible flood is true. As for the ark, I know it's true, but you cannot know it's true unless you know what I know, and I don't expect you to know what I know, but it is true. I'm just saying it is. There was an ark with 8 people aboard, and all other humans were drowned. Whether you accept that or not is meaningless to me, and it should be meaningless to you that I think that. So if you have some prejudice right now, get your ass out of my sight. Virtually speaking. That's how I feel. And that's not going to change because I know what I know and I know it's right. And I know the difference between true and false and right and wrong. So the Bible story is true about the creation of humans. It's the only logical story we have. far superior to the ridiculous quasi-theory of Darwin, which he didn't even know what he was talking about. Well, what about cosmological expansion? Our current theory of the origin of the universe leads us, actually it's the other way around, but the Big Bang essentially and cosmological expansion are part of the same model. And cosmological expansion was, quote unquote, theorized first. And from cosmological expansion, you can logically retract in time to get the origin, since it's a time function. It's a function of time. That space is expanding either through time or in time or whatever preposition you use. But space itself expanding makes no logical sense. It's an irrational thing to say, because we already know that space has not that characteristic. Now, actually, one of the reasons I brought up this rather deep and extraordinarily complex topic, not complicated, but complex, there's some interrelated ideas here. And it is possible, and I will admit this openly, that it is possible that space is expanding. And the reason I say that is that Einstein proved that space does have at least one characteristic, which is that it can be contracted by a proton, producing an effect in space that's spherical curvature. That is the basis of our insight and the unification theory that I've already achieved, that I'm attempting in these current lectures to promote, that is, to publicize, so that you will have this option of logical thought and the option for a synthesis to understanding, which is elusive to physicists. They cannot achieve this goal yet, but we're trying to. Well, I've done it, and in science you have to add, I've learned this, I've done it to a new threshold. And so I'm attempting to share what I know, because this is the vow that a true scientist takes. I can't just sit back and go, well, I got mine made. No. And actually that would not be productive even to myself, because a scientist gains from expressing what he knows, because then he can get feedback, even from himself. Just hearing what he himself says, it's just a feedback mechanism that as we speak our thoughts, we hear them as if coming from someone else. It's just strange, but it works this way, and I found this out from listening to my own lectures. I learned from my own lectures. Well, part of that is due to the fact that I'm on a discovery vector, and having that feedback is just an advantage. I'll just say it has the potential to lead to further synthesis, and I've discovered that that is true, so I'm sharing that with you as a basic principle. Teachers say this very often to their classes, is that they're not just trying to indoctrinate what the class to their benefit, that's why they're there, with no effect on the teacher, that he's just a broadcasting box. No, the teachers that I've been exposed to all say, and I believe that all teachers believe this, they benefit from teaching, partially from what I just said, that there's a feedback mechanism. And in fact, when students come with their questions, it should always be encouraged, and every good teacher does encourage questions, because that is science. That is how you learn, is by asking questions. You actually must do it. Well, that helps the teacher, because it challenges the teacher to answer the questions that he thinks he's already answered, but perhaps he could answer them better. Well, it happens all the time. Well, that's what we're doing with space-time. Space-time is considered to be understood, and it's superpositional, so it's definitely true that we do understand space-time. But do we understand it as well as we could? Everyone knows that we don't, yet. We're trying to understand it better. Now, what I've done is discovered the geometrical basis for understanding it better, and that's quite a complex proposition, which has required the full 2 years I've devoted to making sure that you understand that we do need the geometry that I discovered in order to approach space-time. And really, it's a whole complex of unanswered questions going all the way to quantum mechanics, which I have proved are related. So the paradoxes at both ends of the spheric spectrum, the infinitesimal, which is the quantum, and the cosmological question, which has to do with the integral of mass and space, these are reciprocal questions seen in spherical geometry. So that's the basis of my approach, which I did not begin with that. I was attempting to just come to grips with quantum mechanics because I needed to understand light. Well, that's an hour and 20 minutes, so that's enough for now. I hope you enjoyed this. I am going to publish this, I just decided. I don't know if this might help you, but I believe that I know it will if you had the patience to listen through this whole thing. I hope and pray that this helped you. It helped me to get it out, okay? Because in the next lecture, I'm going to tell you some of the most difficult to understand solutions that have ever been achieved in the history of mankind. And that's rather humbling to someone like myself, who is only seeking to give guided tours of the universe to show you what we already have found, which I find sufficient for me to conquer my fear of death. I no longer fear death because I know about the cosmos and the super designer. Whether you are able or willing or in any way concerned about achieving that goal is entirely up to you, but it is in my heart my duty to share with you what I have found, which is of transcendental significance to this one poor man, okay? I am not a physicist. I'm not a PhD. I'm not a Nobel Prize candidate. I disregard all of these things, and I'm not seeking money. I have no further connection with this world other than the fact that I'm here. My future is elsewhere, and that's my religion in a nutshell. I'm satisfied with what I've done so far, but I'm not done because I took a vow before the open face of heaven to share what I know with you, whoever you are. May the Great One bless you. And perhaps I've been of some assistance to you in achieving the blessing that you want for yourself. That's what I wanted to say. So stay tuned, because the next few lectures have the capacity, I believe, to change science and humanity. And if that's just you, that's good enough for me.